Further, what we saw on Tuesday, not only did he plug $2.5 billion worth of federal stimulus money into filling his budget holes, on top of that, he said, hey, you know what? That's not enough. So what are we going to do? We're going to raise taxes under Jim Doyle's budget $2.2 billion, not million, but $1 billion over the next 2 years. Now that is remarkable. There's all sorts of other things in there. Any of you remember the so-called truth of sentencing? I remember it well because I was the author of it in the State Assembly years ago. He returns parole in the state of Wisconsin in the form of what he calls early release. Didn't get a lot of attention in the paper, but that's something that's on the horizon if Jim Doyle has his way with his budget. But when it comes to finances, it is remarkable. Does anybody in their right mind think that adding $2.2 billion more in taxes to individuals and employers in this state at a time when we're facing probably the largest economic crisis any of us have seen in our history, or at least close to it, does anybody think that raising taxes is the way to bring jobs back? I don't think so. I think if anything we should be finding ways to provide incentives for people to stay here, to grow here, for businesses to want to come and expand here. I think we should be bending over backwards to find ways to create and save and grow more jobs in this great state of Wisconsin. Now, the only bit of optimism about this is what the next step is for us, because certainly it's going to be a challenge. We've got to fight the fight. Sheila and I were talking about how frustrating it is as Republicans in Madison, because when you're not in charge of either the Assembly or the Senate, it's hard to stop or at least slow things down. But as we saw in Washington, when Republicans stood together on the stimulus bill, particularly in the House of Representatives, which is remarkable, it started to change the focus of the American people. The American people originally thought a stimulus idea sounded like a pretty good deal until they started to look at what was in it. Until House Republicans stood shoulder to shoulder and said, it is about time to start looking out for the American people on this, and the public tide started to change, and I think the same thing's true here in Wisconsin. But I want to leave you with this last thing as we look ahead for, again, just a little over a year and 8 months from now, and where I think hope is on the way. And it's as simple as this. When I grew up, I live in Wauwatosa right now with Matt and Alex and my wife, Tonette, but I didn't always live there. I grew up down in Delavan in Walworth County. In fact, that's where I got my inspiration, was as a young man growing up in Delavan, just down the way from Paul Ryan, the congressman from Janesville, where he grew up as well. Paul and I were inspired back in the 1980s in the public service by Ronald Reagan. Plain and simple. He knew who he was, he knew where he was going, he knew where he was going to get there. He had a simple message. It was about a strong national defense, it was about limited government, it was about lower taxes, and putting people back to work again. And that inspired us into wanting to be like him. But there was another guy about that same time who came in under similar circumstances. Remember back in the 80s, in 83 and again in 85, we were facing that national recession that had an impact on Wisconsin. Had a huge budget deficit at the time, and there was a guy by the name of Tony Earl, a Democrat, who was the governor. In fact, that was the last time there was a Democrat governor, Democrat Assembly, Democrat State Senate. Remember what they did to balance that budget? They didn't become more efficient. They didn't cut the size of the workforce. They didn't do things differently. No, they said the taxpayers are going to make up the difference. And so they imposed a 10% surcharge on income taxes, and they made the state sales tax permanently up to 5%. Well, I remember how bad that was, and I'm sure some of you, the same thing is true as on this side of the state as well with Minnesota. But at least where I grew up in Walworth County, we bordered Illinois. Our neighbors over here. We bordered the Illini state. We bordered Illinois. And things got so bad after those tax increases that people and jobs started to leave the state in such numbers that there was a governor in Illinois by the name of Jim Thompson, one of the few I might add who's not been indicted, but Jim Thompson, a Republican. Jim Thompson put up billboards on the state line. I remember them well, because Walworth County was right there on the state line. Remember what they said? They said, when the last business leaves the state of Wisconsin, turn off the lights. It was that bad. You remember it down there, right? It was that bad, and it had that vivid a message. And thank God, literally, thank God, that about that time, a friend of ours down the way from Elroy said, you know what? We can do better. We're from Wisconsin. And he had a clear message. Like Reagan, he said, limit the size of government, control taxes, demand personal responsibility. And if we do that, we can put the state back to work again. And he did. And he didn't just win. In the late 1980s through the early 1990s, he did exactly that. He turned Wisconsin around again. He built this state into the great state it is and will be again. That's what gives me hope for the future, because I know it's happened before. I don't want to see us go through this again. If there's any way, anyhow, we can avoid that from happening, I don't want to go through what happened in the early 1980s. But I do know that when things turn so hard to the left that they get out of control and jobs and people and resources start to leave, that if we have a clear message and a clear messenger or messengers who are willing to lead that forward, we can convince the people of this great state that it's time to get back to the basics, it's time to get back to our roots, it's time to put Wisconsin back to work again. What I ask of you here tonight is not just to pick a particular candidate in some future election, but to find candidates at all levels. For governor, for Senate, for Assembly, we already got the Senate here, but for other Senate seats, for other spots where there's a vacancy, or where there's a vacancy not in office, but in terms of the character of the message that we need to lead forward in races adjoining areas like this, where we need help. Find those messengers who believe in that core message. Things like limited government, things like lower taxes, things like personal responsibility. Find people who are truly committed, not to their own careers, but to putting people back to work again. The kind of things that Shelia has done, a number of my good friends and colleagues nearby here have done. Find those messengers and then do everything possible to make sure that a year and 8 months from now, we not only find them, but support them and give them the tools and the resources and the grassroots support they need to get the job done come November 2nd, 2010. If, or I should say better yet, when we do that, I'm convinced not just as Republicans will we win, but as people who love the great state of Wisconsin, we will, without a doubt, be winners for many years to come. Thank you for the opportunity to share.